The Scarlet Death had been ravaging the whole country for a long time. Never had there been such a deadly and horrible plague. Blood was both its mark and its manifestation, the color red and the terror of blood. It began with intense pain, followed by a sudden faint, and soon the pores began to bleed copiously. Then decomposition set in. Red spots on the body, especially on the infected person's face, isolated them from society and deprived them of any help or pity. The process of the disease, from contamination to death, took just 30 minutes. However, Prince Prospero was cheerful, daring, and intelligent. When he saw that the population of his territories had been halved, he gathered together 1,000 robust and high-spirited friends, selected from among the men and women of his court. Together, they took refuge in one of the prince's fortified abbeys. It was a large and splendid space, a creation of his, reflecting his extravagant and sumptuous style. The building was surrounded by a thick, high wall, reinforced with iron gates. Once inside, the courtiers used furnaces and powerful hammers to weld the locks. They decided to isolate themselves from external dangers and seal all the entrances to avoid internal chaos. The abbey was completely stocked. With these measures in place, the courtiers were prepared to resist infection. What happened outside was their business. For those inside, worrying about the plague was unnecessary. The prince had equipped his refuge with every form of entertainment. There were clowns, improvising artists, dancers, musicians, beauties of all kinds. And, of course, there was wine. All these pleasures were available inside the abbey, along with security. Meanwhile, outside, the Scarlet Death continued to spread. On the 5th or 6th day of isolation, while the plague was ravaging everything beyond the walls, Prince Prospero organized an extraordinarily magnificent masked ball for his guests. What a dazzling spectacle that masked ball was! Let me describe the halls where the party took place. There were 7 imperial halls in a row. In many palaces, such a sequence offers a wide, straight view, with the open doors lined up, allowing you to look straight through to the end. Here, the layout was quite different, as expected from the Duke and his predilection for the unusual. The halls were arranged so irregularly that you could only see one at a time. After 20 or 30 meters, there was a sharp bend and, at each bend, the environment changed completely. On each side and in the center of each wall, a tall, narrow Gothic window opened onto an enclosed corridor, which followed the curved shape of the halls. Each window had stained glass windows whose colors matched the predominant shade of the decoration in the respective hall. For example, the hall at the west end was decorated in blue, and its stained glass windows were also bright blue. The second hall was decorated in purple, with stained glass windows of the same color. The third was all green, including the windows. The fourth, decorated in orange, was lit by a window of the same color. The fifth hall was white and the sixth violet. The seventh was completely covered in black velvet tapestries, covering the ceiling and walls, and extending in thick folds over a carpet of the same color and material. However, in this room, the color of the stained glass windows contrasted with the decoration. They were scarlet red, with a deep blood tint. In these rooms, there were no lamps or chandeliers among the abundance of golden decorations that adorned every corner and the ceiling. No traditional lighting such as lamps or candles was used. However, in the corridors around the rooms, directly opposite each window, there was a heavy tripod with a brazier, emitting light through the colored stained glass windows and illuminating each room in a spectacular way. This created an infinity of changing and fantastic shapes. But in the room facing west, the Black Hall, the light from the brazier, reflected in the black tapestries and through the scarlet stained glass windows, was extremely sinister and cast such a bizarre appearance on the faces of those who entered that space that very few dancers dared to enter. In that same hall, leaning against the east wall, stood an enormous ebony carillon. Its pendulum swung with a dull, heavy, monotonous ticking, and when the minute hands completed the cycle, and the hour came to an end, a clear, resounding, deep and surprisingly melodic sound emerged from the bronze gongs. It was so rhythmic that, every hour, the musicians of the orchestra would briefly pause their music to listen to the sound of the carillon. The dancers would involuntarily interrupt their dances. A momentary disturbance overtook the joyful crowd and, at the sound of the carillon, even the boldest turned pale and the oldest and most pensive put their hands to their foreheads, as if lost in confused thoughts or daydreams. As soon as the echo of the hours died away, soft laughter echoed in the room. The musicians looked at each other and laughed nervously at their own anxiety and eccentricity, silently promising themselves not to get upset next time. But when an hour passed with its 3,600 seconds, and the clock sounded again, the same trembling, the same shivers and the same feverish reveries repeated themselves. Even so, the party was still lively and splendid. The Duke's style was remarkably unique. He had a refined eye for colors and the effects they produced. He ignored fashion trends. His designs were audacious and extravagant, and his creations shone with wild splendor. Some thought he was mad, but his courtiers knew better. However, it was necessary to see and touch him to be sure that he hadn't lost his sanity. For this ball, the prince had personally taken care of the decoration and furnishings of the rooms, and it was his peculiar taste that defined the style of the masks. There is no doubt that they were grotesque creations. Everything was dazzling and resplendent. Shocking and fantastic elements abounded, reminiscent of what was later seen in Hernani. Arabesque figures with disproportionate shapes and ornaments, fantasies as wild as madness. Beauty, licentiousness and bizarreness were mixed together, something terrible and very repulsive. It seemed that an infinity of dreams floated back and forth through the 7 rooms. These dreams moved in all directions, taking on the color of each hall, making the peculiar music of the orchestra seem like a reflection of their footsteps. But then the ebony clock in the velvet hall sounded. For an instant, everything stopped, everything fell silent, except for the sound of the clock. Everyone remained motionless. The echoes of the chime quickly disappeared, lasting only a moment, and as soon as they ceased, muffled laughter resounded through the room. The music then resumed, reviving the dreams. Everywhere, the dancers resumed their dances, more animated than before, reflecting the color of the stained glass windows illuminated by the braziers. However, in the westernmost hall, no one dared enter as night fell. There, a scarlet-red light shone through the blood-colored stained glass windows, and the darkness of the black curtains was frightening. For those who stepped onto the carpets of this hall, the sound of the ebony clock was even deeper, more solemn and powerful than the sound that reached the ears of the masked men in the more distant halls. However, the other halls were packed and full of energy. The ball continued, reaching its peak when the carillon sounded at midnight. At that moment, as mentioned earlier, the music stopped, the dancers stopped their movements. An anguished paralysis spread through everyone. This time, the chime struck 12 times, echoing more than ever. This led people to reflect more deeply as they indulged in the fun. And perhaps that's why many in the crowd, even before the last echoes of the last chimes had finished, noticed the presence of a masked man who until then had gone unnoticed. As the news of this intrusion spread in whispers, a murmur of surprise and disapproval infiltrated the crowd, evolving into fear, horror and disgust. In a surprisingly strange crowd like the one I described, an apparition had to be truly extraordinary to cause such a sensation. The unbridled debauchery of that night was really beyond limits. However, the figure in question had gone beyond the excesses of a Herod and broken with the norms of decency laid down by the host, the prince. Even in the most audacious hearts, there are strings that cannot be touched without provoking emotion. Even among the most debauched, for whom life and death are just games, there are limits that must not be crossed. The guests seemed to feel deeply the discomfort caused by the stranger's attire and behavior. He was tall and thin, wrapped in a funeral shroud from head to toe. The mask that covered his face accurately reproduced the appearance of a rigid corpse, and a keen eye would find it difficult to tell the difference. However, the frenzied crowd might have tolerated and even appreciated this unpleasant figure if the masked man hadn't chosen to represent the Scarlet Death. His clothes were stained with blood, and his broad face, as well as his features, were splattered with scarlet horror. When Prince Prospero's eyes caught sight of the spectral figure, who, with solemn and emphatic gestures, played her part as she moved among the dancers, he was seized by a strong agitation, feeling terror and disgust. A few seconds later, his expression was filled with anger. "Who has the audacity?" he asked the courtiers around him in a hoarse voice, "who dares to insult us with this ironic blasphemy? Hold him down and remove his mask so that we can find out who he is and decide how we will deal with him at dawn." Prince Prospero was in the Eastern Hall, known as the Blue Hall, when he uttered these words. His voice echoed powerfully and clearly throughout the 7 halls, for the prince was a fiery and strong man, and he had silenced the music with a gesture. At this moment, the prince was accompanied by a group of pale courtiers. At first, as the prince spoke, the group moved slightly towards the intruder, who was almost within reach for a moment, but the masked man continued to advance with firm, majestic steps towards the prince. However, the indescribable terror that the masked man's audacity had instilled in everyone present prevented anyone from putting out a hand to stop him, even when he was only 2 steps away from the prince. The entire assembly, as if obeying a single movement, retreated from the center of the hall towards the walls. The masked man continued on his way uninterruptedly, maintaining the same solemn and calculated steps he had adopted from the beginning, moving from the Blue Hall to the Purple Hall, from the Green Hall to the Orange one and so on, without anyone stopping him. Prince Prospero, enraged and ashamed of his momentary cowardice, moved quickly through the 6 rooms, but none of the guests followed him, as they were all overcome with fear. He wielded a knife and approached within a few steps of the retreating masked man. However, as the masked man approached the black-carpeted room, he suddenly turned, facing his pursuer. A high-pitched scream echoed and the dagger fell with lightning speed, striking the black carpet, where Prince Prospero fell dead instantly. In a desperate act, the crowd of masked men threw themselves towards the dark room and, grabbing the stranger who stood motionless like a statue under the chime, were horrified to discover that there was no physical form under the shroud and the corpse mask. It was then that everyone realized that the Scarlet Death was present, like an unwelcome intruder. It had crept in like a shadow in the night. And all those present fell one after the other into the halls where they had been enjoying themselves, bloodied and dying in the same desperate position in which they had collapsed. The ebony clock stopped ticking when the last of those licentious individuals perished. The flames of the braziers were extinguished. And darkness, destruction, and Scarlet Death extended their unlimited control over everything. What did you think of this story? If you liked it, subscribe 'cause there's much more to come. See you in the next video.